What do you know about politics? What should you know? Forget views, beliefs, and opinions. Politics is really a science, and that's where we come in. Welcome to Inside Political Science. I'm Kirby Goodell.
I'm Todd Kent, and we're your guides to what's actually happening in politics. We're using our years of experience to navigate political data, media, money, behavior, and more to educate and inform you.
This episode was recorded October 22nd, 2 weeks before Election Day, so our hosts could give their final perspectives on the presidential campaigns.
We're back for another episode. Todd, I can't believe they keep letting us come back. And we're now exactly 2 weeks from the election.
Things are getting more exciting every day, and there's more interesting things to talk about. This election is certainly unique in my lifetime. And it has all kinds of twists and turns, and I think we're still seeing that.
Every election is special, and today we are very, very fortunate to have with us a special guest. One of the great things about being a political scientist, one of the great things about being an academic is meeting really smart people. Today our guest is Katie Searles. She is and let me get this right, the Owen D. Johnston Chair of Political Science at the University of South Carolina, formerly at Louisiana State University. I think we have to boo a little bit about that or hiss a little bit about LSU since they're coming to town. And Katie's got a world of expertise across lots of different topics, a couple of recent different books on how to construct political expertise, and then also on how technology is changing the way we think about the world. And Katie was the founder or co-founder of Women Also Know Stuff, which was designed in order to increase the role of women as experts in the media, a really important initiative, and so especially glad to have you there. And Katie knows lots of stuff. So 2 weeks out from the election, and it looks like it's basically a tie. It seems like we're back to a coin toss. Maybe if the polls are right, and we don't know if the polls are right. What are you watching? What's catching your attention right now?
Well, as you noted at the top, there's so many things that are unique about this election. So many things that are interesting for observers like us. One of the things that I'm thinking a lot about that isn't necessarily in my wheelhouse, but it's something I'm interested in, like lots of people in your audience, are the polls right?
Yeah.
I had a really interesting conversation with a pollster in which he said, we're all doing all kinds of waiting. It's all new. And none of us know if it's working. Right. And so I'm really curious to see how that will all pan out. It's hard not to see the polls right now through any other lens than the 2016 of it all. But I am wondering if we're seeing a lot of hesitation, a lot of pretty conservative moves in a lot of the polling choices we're seeing, but we just won't know until, hindsight. So that's something that, the nerd in me is just really interested in. But from the perspective of news media, it's been really fascinating to watch this election for lots of reasons. It's an extraordinary election. We have some very extraordinary, unique candidates. And we have the first Black woman running for a major party. And that by itself is something that is just utterly fascinating to observe. So I'm paying a lot of attention to how the news media are covering Vice President Harris. What they're trying to make of it, and how they are continuing to cover Trump, which has been a long-standing, difficult challenge for the news media. So lots to unpack there.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is really fascinating, you mentioned the polls first. Nate Cohn from the New York Times came out and said basically the election's so close, the polls aren't really much help. Yeah. Todd has done polling. We know that polling is of limited help in really close elections. But we also have, as you mentioned, this unique setting where we have a Black female East Asian candidate, lots of different, very much looks like America, but also we don't really know how the polls might work with that. We know in 2016 Trump underpolled. Might Kamala Harris be underpolling, overpolling? And I don't think any pollster really has a great take on this, because if you estimate based on 2016 estimates and you expect Trump to be underpolled, Trump's probably winning the election. If you look at what's happened in recent cycles, it looks like the Democrats are winning the election. And so that we don't really know how this is really playing out among voters except through the polling, and the polling seems at best a limited guide.
It's very.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say Todd can speak more to that for sure.
Well, it's so interesting because Donald Trump's numbers have been within this narrow window for 4 to 6 years. I mean, it doesn't matter what happens; it stays between about 46 to 48, somewhere in that range. So that's interesting. I think what it's interesting if you listen to the pollsters, they're all talking about we're trying new things, we're looking at new data, we're weighting the data differently, we're trying to figure out how to make it work, and really what it's going to come down to is how good are the two parties getting their vote out. The ground game is going to really make a difference when it's this close. It's really a couple of percentage points in each precinct around the country that make a difference.
Yeah. What do you think about sort of the challenge of understanding how Kamala Harris is playing as a woman, as a minority, and in terms of media coverage and polling?
Yeah. So I think what's really fascinating is watching the news media try to grapple with covering her. Because you can see for years, the news media have had a lot of difficulty, as I noted earlier, covering Trump. He's a hard candidate to cover because the sort of standard approach to, just reporting on the things they said and offering some analysis doesn't necessarily work with Trump, because he's sort of, one media storm after the other. There's constantly something new and potentially controversial he's saying that there's no real time to recover and do sort of the normal business of the news. And I think the news media have had a very hard time with that. And on the other hand, Vice President Harris is sort of a quote unquote more traditional candidate, in as much as we're not hearing, controversial statement after controversial statement from her. And yet she's a very extraordinary candidate in as much as she looks very much like America, but very unlike any presidential candidates we've seen, right? So it's this weird juxtaposition of Trump, who's just doing his own thing, has always been doing his own thing, and then a sort of quote unquote more traditional candidate that layered on top of all that is, at the end of the day, looks very different from her opponent. I think that's hard. That's hard for folks to grapple with. So what we see is the news media is trying to kind of do their normal thing with her, but then they're grasping at these things that seem so outrageous to be concerned about when you're talking about a candidate like Trump being her opponent, right? She's too scripted. That's what they're saying. Oh my God, she's too scripted, which you get why news media might not like that. And why, after covering Trump for a long time, that might be particularly egregious. But if that's the thing that there is most controversial, it's kind of hard to really get your hands around why that's the news.
Yeah, and so if we were running an experiment, if we could control this election in a nice way where we could really test the effects of gender and race, we would never create these two candidates, right? They make any sort of understanding of what's going on in this context really challenging. And early on, especially, Kamala Harris was very much limiting her news media appearances, very much controlling her news media appearances. Now, as we're getting closer to Election Day, she's kind of aggressively courting the media, going on Fox News, going on 60 Minutes. Is this because she was worried that it wasn't working, do you think? Or do you think it's because this was the plan all along and she was just biding her time until it was the right time to really start talking outside of her comfort zone?
Yeah, I doubt that this is a reactive strategy. I think it's probably pretty smart to hang back as long as you can and just let Trump speak. I think that's part of what they've been doing. I also think, her campaign hasn't had the runway that most candidates have,
Yeah.
right? And so I think that there was probably an adjustment period that is not as visible to spectators like us, but that we can presume was going on. Um, but I also think this is kind of like, old wine in new bottles. It used to be that, like in campaign textbooks, they would talk about Bill Clinton's strategy of like going on, sort of the smaller radio shows and local television shows and what a unique strategy that was. And that worked fairly well for him. I also think it's very much like a national media hot take, right? It's not that she's not doing media, it's that
Yeah.
she wasn't for a long time doing like the kind of big hits.
Right.
But I think on the other side of that coin is the fact that her campaign and her in particular have been doing a lot of sort of alternative news media like podcasts. They've been doing a ton of social media creation. That's kind of where her campaign is really shown. So on one hand, I get why the national news media complain about this. On the other hand, I just don't think most of America cares. Like she's not showing up in sort of the standard stalwart news outlets.
Yeah, and at the same time, then we have the weirdness of the what the Trump campaign has been doing lately, and I don't think the media really knows how to cover him either. Even after he's been in the public arena for almost he's been in the public arena for longer than a decade, but as a politician for about a decade, he says things that immediately draw attention. Sometimes I think that's intentional just to get the attention, just to generate the controversy. But then other times, he had the weird dancing sequence and then he
for 40 minutes.
Yeah, and then maybe more smartly, I kind of like the McDonald's serving the French fries. I thought that seemed more like a smart sort of traditional media move, but I'm not sure the media really have a good handle on how to cover him as a unconventional candidate, even after he's been around as long as he has.
Interesting enough, I think the Harris campaign for a while, her biggest calling card was that she wasn't Donald Trump, and then that was going to. And as long as as Donald Trump continued to say things that kind of were provocative, then that was a winning strategy. It seems to me, and when we first started this podcast months ago, we talked about one of the keys of this campaign is going to be, can Donald Trump be disciplined in what he says? And it seems to me over the last couple of weeks, he's been more disciplined. Less. You can't really point to anything he's said over the last couple of weeks that have become the issue, and so it becomes more difficult to cover Donald Trump as he doesn't say anything as maybe as somebody would say provocative as he did in the past.
I don't know. There was that whole Arnold Palmer incident.
Yeah, well, setting that aside, he's been more disciplined.
Definitely, though. I mean, one of the challenges with Trump has always been that his campaign is actually, and the people who want to run his campaign are very traditional campaigners. They're good at their jobs, and they're trying to control Donald Trump, and they're trying to control the message of the campaign, and then Donald Trump does Donald Trump stuff. And sometimes it seems like maybe it's intentional, maybe it's really thoughtful, like generating a controversy to get additional media coverage, to get attention, to focus attention on the issues that he cares about. And other times, like the Arnold Palmer comments, it's just kind of odd and weird. And it's hard to, I think you're right, though. They want the disciplined Donald Trump that will stay on message. And then there's the challenge of what he might do when he's in front of a camera.
Yeah, that's quite the challenge. I mean, that campaign and Donald Trump in general is masterful at getting sort of the earned media, right? That is something that's the bread and butter. There's not ever quite been a campaign like that, right? And that is something that is the data are pretty clear that can be a very powerful way to influence the electorate. But I think that you're right. It's sort of hard to discern what's strategic and what isn't with him, which I think is what people seem to like, right? I mean, we can be fairly certain that everything Vice President Harris does is strategic, as most candidates are, but Trump certainly does things his own way sometimes. But I do think that there is an interesting way in which I think Vice President Harris is trying a bit of this game that Trump is really good at playing, where of seizing the sort of viral moments. And I actually think that Fox News interview was more about that, about the content creation that would follow from that, than it was about trying to play to undecided voters. And this is my hot take that might not be that hot. I think a lot of this sort of like she's going after undecided voters in the places where they are, right? The sort of non-traditional Democratic campaigning. I think that's more about being able to say she's doing that and about the subsequent sort of content she can create to mobilize and enthuse her base. And it is actually about persuadables, right? Because we all know there's not many persuadables left. And they're not generally watching Fox News, right? So I think this is more of a content creation strategy than it is about actually getting new voters.
Yeah, along that line, they're probably not watching Fox News. They may not be watching any news, and they're persuadable because they're tired of the campaign and they would rather watch Major League Baseball in the playoffs. You know, so there's it's very hard to reach this group, and I think both campaigns, you know, probably sitting around trying to figure out how do we reach this group that it's not committed in any way, uncommitted voters.
Yeah, absolutely.
And to your point, I think it's really interesting that I keep, you know, like we were talking before we started taping, right, about Liz Cheney and Kamala campaigning with Liz Cheney, and who exactly might Liz Cheney be bringing over at this point. And I think you're right, is that it's less about Liz Cheney than doing a thing that says, I'm reaching out to these types of voters, and I want you to be comfortable with me as a candidate, because if you're comfortable with me, you will also feel more comfortable voting for me.
Right. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting strategy. And I do think that this election we will be writing about in textbooks for quite some time. In the way that, you know, when Obama first came on the scene, everybody was like, he's doing online campaigning, right? Like, I was like, what? Incredible. I think that Harris's team is utilizing alternative media platforms and content creators in a way that we have not seen before. And I don't know what the effect will be. I don't think any of us really do, but they seem to be really investing in the digital strategy in a way we have never seen. And so that is something to behold.
In her Twitter account and some of the other things that she's doing, I think are really sort of fat, because it seems aimed at taunting Donald Trump. Or at least using humor, right? Using humor to make fun of him. I'm not exactly sure how that plays in terms of. I think it's the idea is to target the base, but it's also an interesting strategy because it doesn't seem like it's the normal Democratic thing. It may be something that maybe Trump has done more of, but her Kamala headquarters Twitter account has been really funny at times.
Well, and
they're
also
doing a great job. Yeah.
Well, and also I think it's got to be part of like Katie said, a strategic plan to reach younger voters who. But some research has shown that some of the younger voters are kind of like, I don't like either candidate. You know what I mean? And so how can they're not enthused. So there's a motivation factor among younger voters that, you know, we'll worry about it later. And so she certainly has done a good job kind of creating content that really only that group would like.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting how the platform really affords that, you know, so to your point earlier, Kirby, if it were her coming out and taunting him, it doesn't work as well, particularly because she's a Black woman. But because it sort of has a third person effect where it's like sort of a disembodied account that is kind of tongue in cheek, I think it really works. But yes, I don't think that sort of strategy is going to win over broad swaths of voters. I think it's playing very specifically to the generations that live on the internet, right? That, you know, to Todd's point, are not necessarily known for turning out to vote. So it is a risky strategy, but it is an interesting one in as much as I think that this campaign is setting a bar for other campaigns that will, regardless of whether or not such a digital strategy, leads to a huge conversion of voters. I think it's clear now that this has to be a component of campaign strategies moving forward.
And there may be some signs it's working. I'm not sure what to make of the early voting numbers yet, but it looks like we're breaking records all over the place. But it looks like also that Republicans who have traditionally liked to vote on Election Day are also deciding to come out early. And I know this has long been talked about in campaigns, that early voting sort of changes the cycle and the timing of messaging and everything else, because what you really want is your voters to come out so they don't even the last part of the campaign can't sway them. But it is interesting that everywhere, including Texas, including Houston, we're seeing large numbers in terms of the early voting. So this could be a really high turnout election.
Yeah, and I agree. I think that it remains to be seen whether these are new, whether it could just be that we're seeing a lot of early turn because the strategy of the Republicans was to get their people out earlier. Democrats have done a better job of that in the past, and so we just see a lot of people voting early. It'll be interesting to see on Election Day if the numbers are down. Just because so many people have already voted.
Yeah.
The other thing that we've noticed is in the advertising campaigns, there have been some major shifts in terms of the focus of the advertisements on the Republican side, moving from immigration and crime towards transgender types of issues. The ad in Texas, which you probably haven't seen, but it's a Ted Cruz ad against Colin Allred, and it's very much Colin Allred wants to let boys in the girls' locker room, and he wants to let boys play women's sports, and so on and so on. And that seems to be taking place across the board, also in the presidential race. And then on the Democratic side, it seems like there's less focus on abortion and more focus on taxation, and really about taxing the rich and making them pay their fair share, much more of a populist type message. Is that because those other issues just don't do much anymore? Do you have a sense of maybe what the campaigns are thinking about there? Because I found it a little surprising.
Yeah, it is an interesting shift. Recently, the New York Times had a really great, I don't know if expose is a little bit of a dramatic word for it, but a really great article on some of the experimentation that's going on in the Democratic side.
Yeah.
On particularly around ads. And it is not new that campaigns would constantly test their ads. But I think we're at a moment in which it is cheap to constantly deploy A/B tests or more complicated experimental tests around digital ads just over and over and over and over and over again. And we're really seeing that come into fruition on the Democratic side, at least that we know of. I'm sure there's some of that happening on the Republican side too. But we also know from the research that Democrats, because of sort of the tech skills that they often attract, are often kind of on the frontiers of some of this testing and analytics. So to the extent that we know that that's happening behind the scenes, I would have to imagine that these sort of moves are very purposeful and are driven by the data. The thing that I would be worried about, and as political scientists, we know that you can collect endless amounts of data, but if you don't have strong priors, if you don't have strong theory, all the data in the world could lead you astray, right? And so I think it's hard for us to know the extent to which this data-driven approach will bear fruit, right? Because to some extent, a bunch of people online on their computers hitting up or down on voting on different ads may be a great reflection of attitudes in that moment. But for example, like I've done eye tracking, which is when you look at people's pupils to see what they're paying attention to when they're looking at ads. So I've eye tracked folks that are looking at a variety of ads. One of the things that was really interesting is that people would say they really liked the ads that emphasized women's issues and women's healthcare and abortion when you ask them to report out their attitudes in the sort of standard way. But what we saw in the eye tracking data is that the ads that were around women's issues, that people were not capturing people's attention at all. So, I think that there's complexities to how people report out what they like and don't like, to collecting massive amounts of data without strong theoretical priors, that we may see play out a little bit, but of course we won't know until later. So that's something I'll be really curious to see. But this sort of shift to sort of like the bread and butter economic issues this late in the race seems strange to me. On the other side, Trump's focus on sort of these trans ads, I can only imagine they're seeing or hearing that that's playing well to a certain base that they need to get enthused. But yeah, it's anybody's guess. It's an extraordinary set of issues to be focused on in the last remaining days.
Don't you think we can kind of make the assumption that when we were seeing huge shifts in money being spent on certain kind of ads, that it's purposeful, that it could be that the Harris campaign says we're not moving numbers like we used to, and we've got to change. And the Trump campaign said we think maybe we can move some numbers if we focus on the trans issue. So that these are purposeful, and it kind of gives us a hint of what they think is happening out there among the voters.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, sometimes I think that the key is whether or not we think that this purpose is really reflective of something that will be effective that the public really needs, or if it's something about the way they're collecting data, the way they're measuring folks' attitudes, the sort of inputs they're focusing on, right? That's hard for us to know, but it's still really interesting to think about what this says about where the campaigns think they're at, right? And one thing I keep thinking about, and it's hard, again, not to get angered by previous elections, but in 2016, one of the critiques of the Hillary campaign was that she didn't talk about the economy enough, right? Like that she didn't talk about issues and she didn't talk about the economy enough. And that, surprisingly, despite all the sort of like provocative statements, that Trump was spending a lot of time, particularly in his ads, talking about issues. And so I wonder if there's like an element of that, like focus on the economy, like it's the economy stupid, making a resurgence in the Democratic Party. But then you have Republicans focusing on sort of trans issues, which just seems like, it just to explain American politics in a nutshell, right? Like one party focusing on the economy and the other on trans issues.
Yeah, you see, campaigns kind of coming home. I mean, Republicans have kind of, social issues have been kind of their big way of keeping everybody together over the years. And so maybe you're seeing Trump coming home by focusing on a social issue and certainly I think I looked this morning, I looked at some crosstabs, and still inflation in the economy is one of the top issues among all voters. And so it's smart to kind of to talk about economic issues. If you don't do it, you're probably a campaign that's lost your way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So we're starting to run out of the time that we have you for, but I did want to make sure to mention this, and I didn't leave enough time for it, but we're watching the campaign on cell phones and iPads, and we're moving away from traditional TVs, though TV still matters in lots of different ways. But how does that change all of this? Wow, what a question to give you just a few minutes to answer. That could have been the entire episode, right?
We'll have to come back sometime.
Yeah.
Yes. So I think that we're starting to see this. I'm seeing this a lot on the Dem side, less so on the Republican side, although, time will tell. But we're seeing, for example, the Harris campaign really focusing on digital ad spend. And a lot of that is on streaming. And I think streaming is a whole new ballgame. It's a world, an advertising world we don't fully understand. My advisor, Travis Ridow, is doing a lot of work on this. That's a new frontier. But I think that, first of all, the investment in digital signals that campaigns recognize that they're now trying to speak to a crowd that's on multiple devices, right? They're maybe watching the debate and they're also on their phone. They're, doing work on their laptop and maybe YouTube's playing in the background, right? So people are doing what we call second screening, which is when you hold your phone and watch something. And that's an entirely different experience. And on top of that, they're endlessly scrolling on whatever platform they so choose. And even if they're folks that are not political, not consuming news, which most of Americans are of that nature, then they are still occasionally seeing, stuff pop up in their Instagram feed, stuff pop up in their Facebook feed. And I think that the huge digital ad spend we're seeing on the Harris side is really kind of a signal that campaigns are starting to meet that occasion, even though that's been the case for a long time. Although the thing that always is hilarious to me is like how much campaigning is a recession-proof industry, because it can be the case that fewer and fewer people watch live TV, and campaigns are still going to spend at least half their budget on broadcast television ads, and that is still the case. That's not going away. They're just spending more money also on the digital, and so more is more in American politics, and that's not going to change anytime soon, whether you're on your phone or your laptop or on watching TV.
Yeah, and the streaming is really fascinating because they have such good data on you, and you mentioned why I was watching a based on real events movie the other day and looking at my cell phone while also watching it and looking up to see what was true about the what had they taken liberty in terms of, and then also having ads come through at various times. It's really fascinating.
It's wild. And we haven't even touched on micro-targeting. We were seeing micro-targeting, I think, really have its day. In the past, we've talked about micro-targeting. I don't think campaigns utilize it to the extent to which maybe there was sort of mythology around it. I think we are seeing it really being deployed in a way that's more sophisticated than we've ever seen this time. But maybe we'll have to talk about that post-election once we know the answers.
Yes, well, we would love to have you back. We thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to seeing what's next in terms of your research agenda. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
It was so fun. Yeah. Thanks, guys.
And we'll be back after a break.
On election night, as early numbers trickle in, where will you be turning for a reliable assessment of what happened at the polls, what's at stake, and what comes next? I'm David Brown, inviting you to join us as we bring you a full night of coverage from NPR and from reporters across the Lone Star State. The evening begins with a Texas Standard Special Report at 7, followed by returns and reaction throughout the night from NPR and our news partners statewide.
Tuesday, November 5th on Aggieland's Public Radio, KMU-FM.
PBS Kids welcomes Carl the Collector.
Hello, Rock Collection.
Carl collects things.
The stickers are organized into special categories.
He collects a lot of things.
What's that? My bouncy ball collection.
Including an amazing group of friends.
We made you this friendship bracelet.
For me?
So add Carl the Collector to your collection.
What's more important than a collecting mission? Nothing. Let's go.
A brand new show coming Thursday, November 14th to PBS Kids.
Todd, we are 2 weeks out. Everything's tight. Everything's crazy. It's going to get crazier. What are the things that our listeners should be paying attention to as we go into these last 2 weeks?
As you get to the end of a campaign, the one thing that nobody has enough of is time. And so where are the campaigns deciding to send their candidates in these last days? And usually what you look for is, are they going to places that are going to get new voters, or are they trying to shore up, weaknesses where they should be doing better? So, you look at the cities and the states where Donald Trump and Vice President Harris are going, and it tells us a lot about what's happening in the campaign.
And sometimes, though, it's a mistake, right? So in 2016, I think most of the people who were watching the election thought Hillary Clinton made a mistake. She thought for sure she was going to win in the Rust Belt, didn't go into Michigan, and ended up losing. And I think a lot of people, she thought she was expanding the base, felt like her lead was safe, and that she didn't have to visit those places, and she was wrong.
No, that's certainly the case. Well, and that comes to what the internals are saying, what the internal polls are saying. Did Hillary Clinton have enough lead in Wisconsin to bring it home? And evidently not. And so I think that's where they play. There's a risky game, but they have a limited amount of time. Where are they going to kind of spend that time? So so I think we should look around the kind of the swing states as we talk about them and see which candidates are there and who's trying to make sure that they're successful.
Yeah, and you mentioned we both done polling, and so we're going to pay attention to the polling, of course, but the polls are so close, they're not going to be super helpful, and especially in those all-important swing states, they're going to be really close. But maybe the thing we're really watching more than the numbers, because the numbers aren't going to tell us who's going to win and who's going to lose, who does it seem like has momentum in those states? And one of the things that seems pretty apparent from the polls, if they can't tell us who's winning, is that it looks like Trump is clawing back into a tie, right? That Kamala Harris initially maybe had somewhat of a lead, and now he's coming back, and we're back to the coin toss election and flip a coin.
Right, and they're looking at other things other than polls, like what's the early voting numbers?
Yes.
By party. Some states you have to register by party, so they're looking at what's the turnout? Is it below or is it above? Where's their momentum? And can a quick visit there make a difference?
Yeah.
And also among groups, like there are certain groups. You go to a certain city. I mean, you look at a state like Pennsylvania; it's very large, and there's different population centers, and so it may be going to a different area of the state that makes a difference.
I think this is now I've been wrong before about elections. In 2016, I was one of those who really thought Hillary Clinton was gonna win the election. Was pretty confident in it. In this particular cycle, I don't ever remember being so unsure about what might happen, and part of it is the polling story, part of it is just the campaigns and the uniqueness of the candidates, but I really feel uncertain about what's going to happen on election night. We've talked about this before, but if it looks like a 2016 election, Donald Trump's going to win by a lot because he's underpolling. If it looks like a 2022 election, and if it looks like the election since Dobbs, Kamala Harris is probably going to win by a lot because Democrats are going to overperform. And I'm super. I know a lot of people get frustrated by politics. I absolutely love this. It's almost like going into the Texas A&M versus LSU game. I don't know who's going to win. That makes it great.
No, exactly right. One of the rule of thumb that we used to use when I was in the polling business is with Republicans, what you see is what you get. And then with Democrats, it would be what you see, what you actually get is slightly less than what you're seeing. So because of turnout reasons. So if that's the case, this race is going to be unbelievably close. And this is where the organization that they built over the last 5 months is really we're going to see the fruit of it.
Yeah. So Donald Trump recently said he hasn't seen any evidence of fraud, but he knows that Democrats are probably trying to cheat, which is a kind of a funny comment. But I do think it's one of the indicators I'm looking for as we move closer to Election Day. And maybe this is maybe I'm reading too much into words and into their meaning, but I feel like if he's talking more about a rigged election, that it's more likely he's going to lose. Do you think that's right, or do you think that's just part of his MO now?
I just, I guess my opinion would be that he just can't not talk about it. You know what I mean? And I'm sure that his campaign wishes he wouldn't talk about it. Because I think he doesn't want to appear to be a victim. He feel like he has some certain momentum. He keeps going back to. Interesting. He's in North Carolina. I think he feels like he's making hay with the hurricane victims. Mm-hmm. That's an idea. But my question is it does he need to do that in North Carolina? If that's the case, then there could be overall problems. So we'll see in the coming days. Do we see Donald Trump move up north? That'll be very important as if we look at Michigan and Pennsylvania, Wisconsin up there. Or is he still down in Georgia and North Carolina?
One thing about sort of the voter fraud claims that I think is important, in 2016 we did a paper after the election, and we found that mobilized his supporters because it's a weird thing because it runs against conventional wisdom. The conventional wisdom before Trump was that if you said there was a rigged election, it would demobilize people because they felt like they couldn't affect the outcome. But with Trump voters, it mobilizes them because they feel like we have to come out in such numbers that they can't rig the election.
Yeah, what's the little saying, too big to rig?
Yes, yes.
So, and then it could be a strategy, and I wouldn't put it past them. So it's this idea that we need to get out and vote because somebody may try to do something, and it's just like Kate, that we talked about. You try these little messages, but you don't know how it's going to work. You don't know what the end result's going to be. It's risky.
Yeah.
And when I think sometimes you can try to get to what is the vote hinge on for any one voter? What is it? You know what I mean? And can you breach that kind of idea and then exploit it?
One thing I'm worried about as we go into the last couple of weeks of the election, and maybe unduly, is misinformation. It seems like with AI, with technology, misinformation's long been part of campaigns. I remember stories about people sending out flyers saying, you could vote on Saturday. You don't have to vote on Tuesday. Right. And that's long been a part of campaigns, but technology amplifies the potential of this. And I don't know whether I'm unduly concerned, but I am a little bit worried about the campaigns putting out information, but maybe even more so someone not part of the campaign. And I'll pick on someone here now, Elon Musk, for example. He's got a lot of power, he's got a lot of money, he's got a lot of potential to put out misinformation, and there's some evidence that he's done so already. Third-party misinformation, are you worried about that?
I think that certainly we know that algorithms, once you look at something, if you were to seek out something about a candidate, you're going to get more about that. That's what the algorithm. So that from that standpoint, you get more of what you want. I think the question is an algorithm that would take you to something to sway you. So that becomes problematic. And I wonder if the average citizen is getting a little more savvy. As they've kind of locked in, we tend to set aside anything that goes against what we believe, we actually will move away from it because we don't want to hear anything that's opposing. So, are we there at the campaign where, look, you can tell me whatever you want, but I'm not listening anymore?
Yeah. Well, and I think maybe the challenge is when it's confirming what we already believe and it seems believable, right? So I'll plead guilty. There was a football game this week between Texas and Georgia. Subsequently, there was misinformation put out about Quinn Ewers, who was going to sit out and go for the NFL draft. It turns out that was not true, and it was easy to see and go, oh, wow. I got to share this with people.
Exactly.
And politics is the same way, right? You see that information, it's confirming, it's something that you're like, oh, this is too good to be true, and you kind of know it, but you still share it because you want other people to see it.
So I wonder if this idea, because we're moving into this digital world where algorithms are drawing or sending stuff to us to listen to or want to watch, if we want to see a continued effort to get people to vote early.
Yes.
And so that once you vote, we don't have to worry about you being persuaded anymore. So if we're going to see that continued thing, and it's certainly been a change for the Republicans this year, where they're talking about early voting. Instead, in the past, it was vote on Election Day.
Yeah.
And so I think it is going to, as we look back on this, it's going to change the way we campaign in the future.
Yeah, and once upon a time, if you were running negative, at least I always liked when campaigns would run that negative ad when it was too late to really respond. Go for the jugular in that last week of the campaign when it's hard to really generate a reaction. You can't do that as well today with early voting, and I think the same is a little bit true with misinformation. And maybe the one thing about misinformation that's really important for our listeners to think about is you should be skeptical when it's against the candidate you prefer. But you should be maybe extra skeptical when it's in favor of the candidate you prefer, because if it's information and it seems just a little bit too good to be true.
Right, I agree. And also I think in the past it was too difficult to respond. Nowadays you can need to get a message out on social media almost immediately, and you can do it. And so it's much more difficult to spring that on somebody as you compared to the past, because you couldn't respond. It just took too long to make an ad. And now we just do it instantaneously.
Well, I'm excited every day for the next 2 weeks. I can't wait to wake up and see what's happened over the last 24 hours, what I missed while I was sleeping, what I missed while I've been at work. That's it for this episode 16 of Inside Political Science. Thank you for joining us. Make sure to go out and vote, and we'll talk to you after the election.
Inside Political Science is a production from KAMU, Aggieland's Public Television and Radio. For more information, visit tx.ag/Inside Political Science. Have a question for our experts? Email them at insidepolicy@tamu.edu. Also, subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss a new episode.